The 27th of June, 1977. Duluth, Minnesota. A day shift nurse drives along London Road toward Lake Superior. In summer, the shoreline can look peaceful, almost postcard perfect. But the lake is deep, and in the early light, the water can feel like a sheet of steel. Above it, an old mansion rises from the trees. Red brick and stone trim, tall chimneys, a terrace stepping down toward the water. Glensheen. At around 7 in the morning, the nurse walks up expecting routine. There should be small signs that the night shift is ending. A voice calling out, a cart being moved, a door opening and closing, the soft noise of care. Instead, she hears nothing. Inside, the air feels still. Long hallways swallow her footsteps. The rooms do not echo with breakfast or conversation. They echo with absence. She moves toward the grand staircase. And there, on the steps, a body lies motionless. Nearby is a heavy brass candlestick, the kind of object you would expect in a mansion like this, decorative and old-fashioned, meant to hold light. In this moment, it reads like a weapon. The nurse runs upstairs. The owner's bedroom door is open. Drawers have been pulled out. Jewelry is disturbed. The room looks as if someone searched it quickly, or as if someone wanted it to look that way. On the bed, 83-year-old Elizabeth Mannering Congdon lies dead. Disabled by a stroke, she required constant care. Now she has been smothered in her own bedroom. The second victim is the night nurse, Velma Piatila, beaten to death on the staircase. 2 women murdered inside one of Minnesota's best-known homes. Before the story becomes legal and sensational, it is worth returning to the human center. Elizabeth Mannering Congdon was 83. She had lived through multiple eras of American life: the early industrial boom, world wars, economic crisis, and the transformation of the post-war decades. She carried the weight of a family name and the practical burden of maintaining an estate that the public saw as a symbol. In her final years, she was physically vulnerable, dependent on others for basic needs. Whatever conflicts existed around money, her life was not a line item. Her death was the end of a human life. Velma Piatila was not part of the fortune. She was there to do a job. Night nursing is demanding work even in ordinary homes, and in a mansion it can add isolation. You are awake while the building sleeps. You listen for changes in breathing, for a call, for an emergency. You become the guardian of someone else's life. Velma did not deserve to die on a staircase. Her murder is sometimes treated as an obstacle removed in a plot. But she was a person, with her own history and relationships, who walked into a shift and never walked out. At first glance, the scene looks like burglary, but almost immediately investigators sense something else in the shape of the violence, the choice of target, and the strange, selective disorder in the bedroom. Because if this was not random, then someone close knew the house, the schedule, and the money. The first calls brought police and emergency responders to a place that did not feel like a typical crime scene. It was not an alley or a small apartment. It was a landmark. Every step inside was a reminder that this building had been constructed to represent control. In cases like this, the first questions are urgent. Who was last seen alive? Who was expected to arrive? Who had keys? Who knew the schedule? Who could enter without forcing a door? Who could move through the rooms without being challenged? The mansion itself becomes part of the investigation, because architecture is also access. Staircases are choke points. Hallways are funnels. Doors are opportunities. A crime in a small home might have only a few routes. A crime in a mansion can have dozens. This is the story of how a Gilded Age fortune built a palace on the shore, and how inheritance turned that palace into a motive. If you enjoy long-form true crime and history told like a story, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel more than you might think, and it means you will not miss the next case. As you listen, keep your own theory in mind, because I will ask for it again at the end. Chapter 1. Duluth, Misabi, and the money that built a palace. To understand why Glensheen mattered, you have to understand the world that created it. Duluth sits at the western tip of Lake Superior. Geography made it important. The lake was a highway, and Duluth was a gate. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ships moved ore, grain, lumber, and manufactured goods through this corridor. Rail lines converged, docks expanded, warehouses rose. The skyline and the harbor grew together, each feeding the other. Northern Minnesota contains one of the most famous mining districts in American history, the Misabi Iron Range. The Misabi deposits were vast and relatively easy to extract compared to older, deeper mines. When those deposits became central to the nation's steel supply, they turned the region into an industrial engine. Iron ore is not glamorous. It is heavy rock that stains hands and clothes. But in the industrial era, iron became destiny. It became rails that connected cities. It became bridges that carried traffic. It became beams that held up skyscrapers. It became ships, and later it became the steel that armed a nation at war. Whoever controlled iron controlled a slice of America's future. That control did not come only from miners and engineers. It also came from corporate structures and contracts. The Mesabi Range attracted companies competing for leases, rail connections, shipping routes, and market leverage. It attracted bankers and financiers who understood that consolidation could turn chaotic competition into predictable profits. And every one of those battles depended on law: titles to land, rights to extract, agreements between companies, terms for shipping, obligations to investors, disputes between rivals. It was a paper world, backed by resources but governed by documents. That is where Chester Adgate Congdon enters the story. Chester Congdon was born in 1853. He trained as a lawyer and built a career that combined legal work with investment. In 1892, he moved to Duluth, at a moment when the city was rising and the mining economy was turning northern Minnesota into a national asset. Congdon did not dig ore. He positioned himself inside the machine that made ore profitable. He became general counsel for the Oliver Mining Company and accumulated wealth through a combination of professional work and investments tied to the Mesabi Range. Duluth in those years carried two identities at once. To the country at large, it could feel remote, a northern city on the edge of a cold inland sea. To the people who lived there, it was a crossroads. You could watch ships slide through the harbor and understand that the world was connected by water and steel. When historians describe the rise of American industry, they often focus on the great coastal cities. But places like Duluth mattered because they linked resources to markets. The Mesabi Range produced ore. The ore moved by rail to the docks. Ships carried it across Lake Superior. From there, it fed mills and factories that might be hundreds of miles away. In that chain, every link became a place where money could be made and power could be gained. The Congdon fortune came from being positioned close to that chain. Chester Congdon understood that extraction was only one layer of the story. Underneath extraction were legal rights. Who owned which tract? Who held which lease? Who could move ore over which routes? Who had authority when disputes erupted? This is why lawyers and corporate counsel became central figures in the industrial era. They were the ones who helped convert raw resources into predictable profit. That world also shaped a certain kind of social ambition. In the Gilded Age, wealth did not only buy comfort, it bought standing, influence, and an invitation into elite circles. Mansions became part of that process. A house could function like a public argument that the family inside it belonged to the permanent class. That is what Glensheen was built to do. Even the location was a kind of statement. Building on Lake Superior meant building in a place where weather could be brutal. Winters were long, winds off the water could cut through clothing, ice could reshape the shoreline. A mansion there was not merely a luxury, it was a declaration of confidence. In 1905, Chester and his wife Clara began building a home that would stand as proof of what they had achieved. Construction continued until 1908. The mansion was designed by Clarence H. Johnston Sr., one of Minnesota's most prominent architects. The formal terraced garden and landscape plan were associated with the Charles Welford Levitt firm. The reported cost was $854,000. Even without translating that into modern figures, it is enough to tell you the intention. This was not a comfortable house. This was a statement. Glensheen would contain 39 rooms. It would face Lake Superior. It would be built with the idea that the Congdon name should not fade. Glensheen was not simply large. It was designed with deliberate layers of privacy. Visitors would enter through spaces meant to impress, rooms where a host could control attention and guide conversation. But the house also included workspaces that were meant to be unnoticed. Staff could move meals from kitchen to dining room without crossing the public hallways at the wrong time. Laundering, storage, repairs, and preparation happened in areas that guests rarely saw. This mattered because the mansion's greatest luxury was not size, it was control. When a household has enough staff, the owners can live as if chores do not exist. Clean rooms appear as if by magic. Meals arrive on schedule. Fires are tended. Beds are made. The illusion of effortless living is produced by constant, invisible labor. Over decades, that structure can shape relationships. It can create distance between those who are served and those who serve. It can also create habits of security, the belief that the household is managed, monitored, and predictable. By 1977, the social theater of Glensheen had faded. Elizabeth was not hosting grand events the way her mother once did, but the structure of routine remained, especially because of medical care. When a home becomes a medical site, routine becomes even more strict. Shift changes, medication schedules, notes left between nurses, lights that must be checked, doors that must remain closed or open. Routine becomes a form of safety. In an ordinary home, breaking routine can cause inconvenience. In a house like Glensheen, breaking routine can create an opening. When you picture the early 20th century elite, it is easy to picture only the obvious: the parties, the fine clothes, the expensive furniture. But the deeper story of houses like Glensheen is systems. A household of that scale functioned like a small institution. Staff roles were specialized. Some staff cooked, some cleaned, some maintained the grounds, some maintained the mechanical systems. The owners could live in public rooms that felt serene because the labor was routed through service corridors and back staircases. This separation shaped the psychology of the house. Owners experienced comfort, staff experienced constant motion, visitors experienced a curated performance of wealth. Architecturally, Glensheen was designed to carry a certain mood. Jacobean Revival style evokes solidity, thick materials, symmetry, a sense of permanence. It is not accidental that wealthy Americans of that era borrowed from European styles. The design was a claim that the family belonged to a long tradition, not a short economic moment. And the gardens added another layer of control. Terraced landscaping takes a natural slope and turns it into geometry. It is nature disciplined into elegance. It tells visitors that even the land is arranged. Those choices matter in a crime story because they help explain why the public reacted the way it did. A house built to symbolize order became the setting of extreme disorder. The contrast is what gives the case its lingering power. Chester Congdon died in 1916. Clara continued the household, maintaining the estate and its social life. But decades pass, whether families are ready or not. By 1950, Clara was gone too. Clara Congdon mattered in this story not only as the wife of a wealthy lawyer, but as a person who helped turn wealth into social legitimacy. In early 20th century elite life, the home was both private space and public theater. The hostess managed staff, schedules, and gatherings. She decided who entered the rooms and what kind of impression the family left behind. She converted money into respectability, partly through philanthropy and partly through social relationships that linked business power to cultural life. This mattered because a legacy is more than money. It is a reputation. It is a story that a community repeats. Glensheen became part of that story. For decades, the mansion suggested that the Congdons were not simply rich, but established. When Chester died, Clara kept the estate functioning, and in doing so, she kept that identity intact. Later generations inherited that identity, whether they wanted it or not. Glensheen remained, and it passed to the family member most closely tied to it, Elizabeth. By the 1972, the United States was living through a very different mood than the Gilded Age. The country had been reshaped by war, by economic shifts, and by changes in trust toward institutions. Many cities faced anxieties about crime, inflation, and social unrest. Even places far from major metropolitan centers felt the cultural tension of the era. Duluth in 1977 was not a boomtown. It was a mature city carrying the residue of earlier prosperity. People still worked the harbor. The lakes still carried cargo, but the sense of unstoppable ascent had softened. Glensheen, however, remained visually tied to the earlier era. It was a reminder of a time when fortunes were built quickly and expressed boldly. That contrast made the mansion stand out even more. To a community, a landmark like this becomes more than architecture. It becomes a story people tell about where they live. That is why the murders felt like a rupture, not only inside a family, but inside local identity. If violence could happen there, then no place was truly protected by reputation or tradition. Chapter 2. Elizabeth Congdon, Family by Choice, and the Burden of Keeping a Legacy. Elizabeth Mannering Congdon inherited more than a mansion. She inherited responsibility. To outsiders, inheriting a grand estate looks like inheriting a dream. But anyone who has maintained an old property knows the truth. A mansion is not a trophy that sits quietly. It is a living system that constantly asks for attention. Roofs leak, pipes fail, heating systems age, woodwork needs care, windows need restoration, gardens demand labor. A property like this consumes money simply to remain itself. If you neglect it, it decays. If you preserve it, it demands endless work. Elizabeth did not marry. Over time, she became the anchor of Glensheen, the one who stayed when other lives moved outward. She was known for philanthropy and for steady persistence. She did what many heirs do not. She kept the estate functioning, decade after decade, even as the world changed around it. But legacy is not only about buildings. It is also about heirs, and about the story a family tells itself about continuity. Elizabeth wanted children. She did not have them by birth, but she created family through adoption. In 1932, she adopted a young girl born Jacqueline Barnes. The child became known as Marjorie Mannering Congdon. In 1935, she adopted another girl, Jennifer Susan Congdon. From the outside, adoption can look like a generous act and a fresh start. Inside a wealthy household, adoption can also carry complicated emotional weight. Belonging and identity are never simple when inheritance exists in the background. A child can be loved and still feel the pressure to prove she belongs. A child can carry gratitude and resentment at the same time, especially if she senses that money and legacy are shaping how others see her. Jennifer, by many accounts, followed a quieter path. Marjorie did not. Elizabeth's later years were shaped by the practical reality of dependence. After her stroke, she could not simply decide to go for a walk or move freely from room to room. Care schedules controlled her days. Nurses were not occasional visitors. They were the structure that made life possible. After Elizabeth's stroke, the mansion was no longer only a symbol of wealth. It became the setting of dependence. A stroke can change everything quickly. Mobility disappears. Speech can become limited. A person who once walked freely may need help with the simplest tasks. For an elderly person, a stroke can also bring fear. Fear of falling, fear of pain, fear of being left alone. That is why round-the-clock nursing mattered. Nurses were not decoration in the household. They were the barrier between stability and crisis. They monitored, they responded, and they created a human presence during the long hours when an old house can feel isolated. In many families, aging shifts power quietly. Adult children begin making decisions. Trustees and attorneys begin protecting assets. Care workers begin managing the day-to-day reality. Even if everyone has good intentions, these shifts can create resentment. The elderly person may feel controlled. The heirs may feel judged. The staff may feel caught between demands. Glensheen contained all of those tensions inside one building. Round-the-clock care creates a particular intimacy. Nurses see the unglamorous details that even family members often avoid. They administer medication. They monitor breathing and circulation. They manage hygiene. They learn a patient's habits, moods, fears, and comforts. Over time, the relationship can become deeply familiar, even if it remains professional. In a mansion, this intimacy exists inside a space built for status. A nurse might push a wheelchair through a corridor built to impress guests. A patient might sleep under an expensive roof while feeling physically powerless. When Elizabeth chose to stay at Glensheen rather than move into a facility, she preserved the image of continuity. She remained in the house her parents built. She remained inside the legacy. But that choice also concentrated risk. The house became both refuge and vulnerability. For Marjorie and Jennifer, the house was also a symbol of identity. It was the place that defined their last name and their childhood. Yet, as adults, their relationship to the house and to Elizabeth could evolve into something more complicated. By the mid-1970s, the family system around Elizabeth looked less like a warm household and more like a network. Nurses, trustees, attorneys, and relatives with different expectations. In that kind of network, misunderstandings can become permanent. Small disputes can harden into narratives. Each person starts telling a story about what is fair and who is to blame. And when a person tells the same story for long enough, the story can start to feel like permission. Chapter 3. Trusts, Debt, and the Pressure that Builds a Motive. In wealthy families, money does not always arrive as cash. It often arrives as restrictions. A trust is a legal arrangement in which assets are held and managed by trustees for the benefit of someone else. Trusts can protect assets from creditors, reduce taxes, and control distribution across generations. They are often designed to prevent impulsive spending and to ensure that a fortune survives the weaknesses of individual heirs. In practice, a trust is a gate. It can open and close. As Elizabeth aged and became disabled, her fortune was managed through a trust structure. Trustees controlled disbursements and tightened oversight. If trustees believed an heir would waste money, they could restrict access. If they believed an heir was financially reckless, they could tighten the valve. This can be done in the name of stewardship, but it can feel like punishment to the person on the other side of the gate. Marjorie Caldwell lived on that other side. Marjorie grew into adulthood with restlessness and instability. She married, had children, faced divorce, and moved through relationships. Over time, her finances became chaotic. Spending, debt, a sense that money slipped away as quickly as it arrived. By the mid-1970s, trustees reportedly tightened control further. Marjorie and her husband, Roger Caldwell, faced serious financial trouble. Foreclosure pressure, repossessions, and a collapsing lifestyle. Marjorie's own trust resources had been depleted. Desperation does not always look like shouting. It often looks like quiet panic. It looks like hiding letters from a spouse. It looks like opening bills at midnight and making calculations that do not work. It looks like a phone call from a lender that ends in silence. It looks like a person staring at a wall, thinking about the one thing that could reset everything. Elizabeth was 83. Her body was fragile. She required constant care. Her schedule was predictable. Her bedroom was known. And she stood, legally and financially, between the Caldwells and the future. It is worth pausing here to understand the emotional geometry of trusts, because this is where many inheritance stories turn. To trustees, a trust is stewardship. They see themselves as protecting the long-term health of assets and respecting the wishes of the person whose money is being managed. Their job is to resist impulse, including the impulses of heirs. To an heir under pressure, the same trust can feel like humiliation. It can feel like being treated as a child. It can feel like being judged by people who control your future. And when money trouble is real, the trust does not feel like a prudent structure. It feels like a locked door. Financial collapse also changes how people think about time. When bills are overdue, the future shrinks. Everything becomes immediate. The mind stops thinking in years and starts thinking in days. It starts thinking in what must happen before the next deadline. If an heir believes that the trust is unfair, and if that heir also believes that the only way the gate will open is through death, the temptation becomes obvious. This does not make murder inevitable. Most people under pressure do not kill. But in the rare cases where murder happens, this is often the logic that makes it seem possible to the person considering it. Roger Caldwell enters the story as both spouse and outsider. In wealthy families, outsiders are often viewed with suspicion, especially if the outsider seems attracted to money. At the same time, outsiders can see things insiders normalize. They can see how power operates. They can see how restrictions feel. They can see the gap between what a family says about itself and what it does. Financial stress can also bond couples in an unhealthy way. When two people are under pressure together, they can reinforce each other's worst ideas. They can convince each other that the world is unfair, that they are being wronged, that drastic action is justified. Trust restrictions can intensify that echo chamber. If Marjorie believed she was being punished by trustees, and if Roger believed his family was being excluded by a system designed to keep them powerless, they could interpret every obstacle as an intentional attack. In many inheritance crimes, the moment that pushes a person from fantasy to action is not greed alone. It is a deadline. It is the sense that time is running out and that the usual tools, pleading, borrowing, bargaining, have failed. Once someone crosses that psychological line, the plan can start to feel like a solution rather than a crime. Chapter 4. The night of June 26, 1977. Two kinds of violence. On the night of June 26 into the early morning of June 27, Glensheen was quiet. Elizabeth remained upstairs, limited by disability. The household ran on routine, especially the nursing routine. Try to imagine the atmosphere of Glensheen late at night. The public rooms downstairs are dark, their furniture sitting like silhouettes. The lake outside is black. The wind can move through trees and create small sounds that feel larger in a quiet building. The house itself can creak as temperature changes. In a modern home, those sounds are ordinary. In a mansion, they feel theatrical. A night nurse in that setting works in a kind of isolation. You are awake while the building sleeps. You check on a patient, you write notes, you listen, you wait. The hours can feel long, and because you are responsible, every unusual sound matters. Now add the possibility that someone enters who does not belong. A house like this offers hiding places, but it also offers traps. A person can get lost, a person can panic, a person can make noise. This is why the killer needed confidence. The crime did not happen in a simple hallway. It happened in a maze. If the killer was a stranger, luck had to be extraordinary. If the killer was familiar with the house, the plan becomes more believable. Velma Piatila was the night nurse. She was a working professional doing a difficult job, caring for an elderly disabled woman through the night. Reports indicate she had come out of retirement to fill in, a substitute nurse. A small change in the pattern. Sometimes a crime finds its opening in a small change. Velma existed to watch and protect Elizabeth. If someone planned to reach Elizabeth, Velma was the barrier. Sometime during that night, violence erupted on the grand staircase. Velma was beaten to death with a candlestick. The method matters. A candlestick is heavy. It is close range. It is personal. It is messy. It is not the clean efficiency of a professional hit. It suggests either rage or desperation, or a sudden decision made in a tight space with no time to plan a quieter solution. After Velma was killed, the killer moved upstairs. Elizabeth was killed in her bedroom. She was smothered with a satin pillow. That method is different. It is quieter. It requires sustained contact. It is controlled. You do not smother someone by accident. You do it on purpose, and you do it until it is finished. Then the bedroom was disturbed. Drawers were opened, jewelry was handled, a jewelry box was missing. The scene carried the appearance of robbery. The scene in the bedroom carried another subtle signal. Staging does not have to be perfect. It only has to be plausible enough to delay the right suspicion. If detectives spend the first days chasing a phantom burglar, precious time passes. Leads cool, memories fade, alibis solidify. A staged scene can act like a fog machine, filling the room with distraction. But staging can also reveal itself. If the disturbance looks selective, if high-value items remain untouched, if the search pattern does not match a burglar's urgency, the disguise starts to fail. That is one reason the jewelry box became so important in public discussions. It was the one missing item that allowed a burglary explanation. Without it, the scene would have looked less like theft and more like something else entirely. But the violence was severe, and the target was specific. In a mansion full of valuables, why take so little? In a case where the key person is an elderly, disabled woman, why risk killing twice? If robbery was the motive, why choose a labyrinthine house where a stranger could get lost? The more investigators looked, the more a stranger narrative felt thin. The possibility of staging moved to the center. The layout of Glensheen added another layer of dread. A mansion is a network of rooms, hallways, and staircases. In daylight, it can feel grand. At night, it can feel like a maze. The grand staircase where Velma was found is central. It is a passage between floors. Anyone moving from the public rooms below to the private rooms above must pass through it. In a quiet house, sounds carry. A step, a door, a voice. That is part of why the murder method is so striking. A candlestick attack is loud and chaotic, the kind of violence that might happen if the plan meets resistance. It also suggests that the killer needed to remove the one person who could call for help or intervene. Then, upstairs, the killing changes style. Smothering is quiet. It reduces the risk of noise, in a house where noise could be everything. Afterward, the disturbed bedroom creates narrative confusion. If the goal was money, why not take more? If the goal was inheritance, why leave a burglary clue at all? A staged burglary has a different logic than a real burglary. A real burglar wants valuables and wants to leave. A staged burglary wants to create a story. The missing item becomes a prop. The open drawers become a message. The disorder becomes an attempt to steer investigators away from the people closest to motive. Investigators often describe two broad families of explanation in cases like this. The stranger theory is straightforward. Someone broke in, confronted the night nurse, killed her, then killed Elizabeth and searched for valuables. The challenge with the stranger theory is navigation and risk. A stranger has to find entry, move through a complex house, handle two murders, and leave, all without being caught, all while taking surprisingly little for the risk. The insider theory does not require supernatural cleverness. It requires familiarity. An insider knows which doors are likely to be locked. An insider knows which paths are quiet. An insider knows where staff members are likely to be at certain hours. An insider can move with confidence instead of hesitation. An insider theory also fits the idea of staging. A stranger does not need to stage. A stranger wants to vanish. A person connected to the household cannot vanish from the story of the household. If suspicion falls on family, the family must live with it. That creates a motive not only to commit the crime but to shape the narrative after it. This does not prove who did it. It explains why the investigation focused on access and motive rather than only on missing property. And if staging is the goal, the most important question becomes simple. Who needs a disguise? Chapter 5. Investigation and Arrest. Building a case in a house full of history. The morning discovery is often the most haunting part of such cases because it is the moment when the private world collides with public reality. A nurse expects a normal shift and instead becomes the first witness to catastrophe. After the bodies were found, the immediate environment was full of details that later become important. Which doors were locked, which lights were on, whether a window was open, whether any valuables were clearly missing, whether the disturbed drawers looked like frantic searching or careful staging. In a mansion, even the absence of noise can be a clue. If someone entered at night, did anyone hear footsteps? Did any neighbors notice a car? Did any staff see an unfamiliar figure? The case became, in part, an attempt to reconstruct silence. In the first hours after the murders, investigators secured the scene, photographed, collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and built a timeline. But Glensheen was not an easy place to read. It was large and filled with objects. Every surface could hold fingerprints. Every hallway created the risk of contamination. Staff had lived and worked in the house for years. Family members and visitors had passed through. A mansion is a place where many hands touch many things. In 1977, forensic tools were more limited than people imagine today. Modern DNA profiling did not exist as an investigative staple. Detectives relied heavily on fingerprints, hair and fiber comparisons, blood evidence that could not be typed with today's precision, and careful reconstruction of movements and timing. Forensics in 1977 lived in a different world than today. There were fingerprint methods, yes, and careful photography, and the ability to compare certain physical traces. But without DNA profiling, many questions stayed uncertain. Hair and fiber comparisons could suggest contact, but rarely offered the kind of certainty modern audiences expect. Blood evidence could be typed, but not with the fine resolution of later techniques. This meant that cases often depended on a combination of physical clues and narrative logic. The question was not only what evidence existed, but whether it could be tied to a specific person in a way that would survive courtroom attack. It also meant that defense attorneys could challenge identification methods more effectively. If an expert claimed a match, another expert might claim uncertainty. The jury then had to decide whom to trust. When the Minnesota Supreme Court later ordered a new trial, it highlighted how legal procedure and evidentiary issues can reshape outcomes. The public often interprets this as the system being inconsistent. The system interprets it as the rules being enforced. Either way, the result is the same: a story that refuses to feel finished. This meant evidence had to be not only present but meaningful. A fingerprint in a mansion does not automatically mean anything. A hair on a carpet does not automatically tell you whose night it was. In the days after the murders, investigators worked through the practical checklist that governs homicide cases. They interviewed staff and family, establishing who had been in the house, who had reason to visit, and who knew details like shift changes. They examined doors and windows for signs of forced entry and compared those signs to the physical reality of locks and latches. They cataloged what was missing and asked whether the missing items looked like the goal or the cover. They tested alibis, not only with words, but with the small frictions of real time. Where was someone at midnight? Who saw them? What time did a receipt print? What time did a call occur? Small details can either strengthen an alibi or expose it. In a case involving a famous home, investigators also had to consider contamination. Many people will want to enter. Some will enter for good reasons, like care staff and responders. But every entry changes the environment, and the longer the scene remains active, the harder it is to guarantee the purity of later conclusions. This is why early impressions can become important. What looked unusual immediately, what stood out before the scene filled with people, what details appeared staged even to the first responders. Investigators also had to confront the social complexity of the case. This was not a street crime. It was a crime inside a famous home with a powerful name attached. Media attention arrived quickly, public opinion formed quickly, so detectives focused on a basic question: who benefits? Elizabeth Congdon was the key to a fortune. When a person dies, money moves. In a family structured around trusts, money moves through clauses and contingencies. It moves through trustees and heirs. It moves through paper. When investigators look at an inside job scenario, they break the problem into practical pieces. First, access. Who had keys? Who could enter without forcing a door? Second, timing. Who knew when the night nurse would be alone? Who knew when the day nurse would arrive? Third, motive. Who gained money or control if Elizabeth died? Fourth, behavior after the fact. Who attempted to steer conversation toward a particular explanation? This kind of analysis can be powerful, but it also carries risk. It can create tunnel vision. Investigators can start to see every detail as supporting one theory. That is why strong cases rely on multiple supports, not only a single narrative. As the investigation unfolded, media attention amplified everything. A famous home and a wealthy family create a gravitational pull for headlines. The details traveled beyond Duluth, and the case became a statewide obsession. On the 6th of July, 1977, Roger Caldwell was arrested in connection with the murders. A St. Louis County grand jury later indicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because publicity was intense, the case was moved out of Duluth for trial. In high-profile cases, courts sometimes change venue to improve the chance of seating an impartial jury. The mansion had already become a character in the public imagination. Now the courtroom would try to compress that myth into evidence and procedure. The investigation also had to account for the house's daily reality. Staff members had routines, vendors came and went, nurses changed shifts, family visited, keys existed. Sometimes doors were left unlocked out of habit because the household felt protected by reputation. Detectives would examine how the house typically operated. Was there an alarm system? Were certain doors usually secured at night? Was the property fenced? Did neighbors see headlights or hear engines in the hours before dawn? They would also look at communication. Who called whom after the discovery? Who seemed to know details too quickly? Who asked certain questions? In high-profile cases, these human signals can be misleading, but investigators still consider them because they can reveal motive or deception. At the same time, investigators must protect themselves from stories that are too neat. A mansion murder invites dramatic theories. The job of detectives is to reduce drama to mechanics: entry, movement, confrontation, exit. When you strip the case down to mechanics, the same pressures return. The killer needed access. The killer needed to deal with the nurse. The killer needed to reach Elizabeth. The killer needed to leave without being caught. Those requirements narrow the field of plausible explanations. Chapter 6. The courtroom years: verdicts, reversals, and a confession that did not close the book. Roger Caldwell's trial began on the 10th of April 1978 in Brainerd, Minnesota. The case was a test of whether prosecutors could turn motive and circumstance into proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jury selection in a case like this is its own quiet battle. Potential jurors arrive with impressions shaped by headlines. Some are fascinated by the mansion, some resent the wealthy, some distrust police, some distrust defendants. The court must find people who can listen, weigh evidence, and follow instructions, even when the case is emotionally charged. This is why change of venue matters, but it does not erase publicity. It only reduces saturation. Inside the trial, the prosecution must translate a complicated story into a sequence that a jury can hold in mind. In long trials, jurors must remember details across days and weeks. A strong prosecution narrative helps jurors organize evidence. A strong defense narrative helps jurors question it. The defense does not need to prove innocence. The defense needs to create uncertainty strong enough to block conviction. When Roger Caldwell was convicted, the verdict suggested that the prosecution narrative held together for that jury. But the later appeal and plea show that the story did not hold forever, at least not within the strict requirements of law. That is one reason public frustration persists. People confuse verdicts with truth. Verdicts are judgments produced by process. Truth is larger, and sometimes the system cannot deliver it in a form that feels complete. In court, prosecutors needed a story with a spine. They had motive. The Caldwells were under financial pressure. They argued that Elizabeth's death would move money and change the Caldwells' future. They had opportunity. Elizabeth was vulnerable, cared for by a small staff on a predictable schedule. They argued that the disturbed bedroom and missing jewelry were a disguise, not a goal. They framed the violence as a sequence: neutralize the night nurse on the staircase, then kill Elizabeth in her bedroom, then create the appearance of burglary. The defense attacked the chain. In cases like this, defense strategy often aims at reasonable doubt. If forensic conclusions can be challenged, if a timeline can be questioned, if alternative explanations exist, a jury can hesitate. In court, the prosecution and defense do not simply present facts. They arrange facts. The prosecution arranges facts into a chain. Motive plus opportunity plus a plausible method equals guilt. The defense arranges facts into fractures. Any break in the chain can create reasonable doubt. In high-profile cases, jurors carry another burden. They know the outside world is watching. They know their verdict will be judged by strangers. This can create pressure to appear decisive, or pressure to avoid being seen as naive. On the 8th of July, 1978, the jury found Roger Caldwell guilty. On July 10, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. For many people, that would be the end. But the day after sentencing, on the 11th of July, 1978, Marjorie Congdon Caldwell was charged as well. Her trial began on the 2nd of April, 1979 in Hastings, Minnesota. Here, the prosecution needed to show not only that she benefited, but that she participated in planning or conspiracy. Trials are not only about facts, they are also about perception. Jurors are human beings. They read faces. They interpret demeanor. They imagine motives. On the 21st of July, 1979, Marjorie was acquitted. One spouse convicted, the other acquitted. The public did not experience that as closure. It experienced it as a split reality. Then another shift arrived from above. In 1982, the Minnesota Supreme Court overturned Roger Caldwell's conviction and ordered a new trial. This did not declare him innocent. It ruled that legal error in the first trial was serious enough that the verdict could not stand. Appeals exist because trials can go wrong. Procedures can be violated. Evidence can be mishandled. Testimony can be presented in ways the law does not permit. The justice system is designed not only to punish, but to correct itself. For the public, this can feel like betrayal. For the law, it is integrity. For the Glensheen story, it reopened uncertainty. Facing the risk of a second trial, prosecutors and defense moved toward an agreement. On the 5th of July, 1983, Roger Caldwell pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. Under the terms of the plea, he did not serve additional prison time beyond time already served. The plea provided one kind of answer, an admission, but it did not provide a fully satisfying narrative. It told the world, yes, Roger did it. Yet it also told the world the first conviction could not hold. The legal system chose certainty of some kind over the gamble of full resolution. The split verdicts of 1,978 and 1,979 created a long-lasting psychological effect. Many people prefer a world where the story resolves in a straight line. One defendant, one verdict, one conclusion. Glensheen refused that shape. When the Minnesota Supreme Court ordered a new trial for Roger Caldwell, it added another layer of discomfort. Appeals can feel like the system undoing itself. But appeals exist precisely because the system knows it can be wrong. The law is built around procedure, and procedure is a shield, even for defendants the public dislikes. The plea agreement created the kind of ending that feels legally rational and emotionally unsatisfying. The state secured a guilty plea. The defendant avoided the uncertainty of a new trial. The public received an admission, but not a cinematic closing scene. One of the reasons plea deals provoke strong emotions is that they reveal an uncomfortable truth about justice. Trials are not only about what happened, they are also about what can be proven within rules. A prosecutor might believe a defendant is guilty and still fear that a second trial could collapse because a key witness is unavailable, a key piece of evidence is disputed, or a legal error has made the record vulnerable. A defense attorney might believe a client could be convicted again and still advise a plea to reduce risk. Both sides make choices under uncertainty. The public rarely sees these calculations. The public sees only the outcome and asks whether it feels fair. In the Glensheen case, the plea meant that the state secured an admission of guilt, but it also meant the story would never be fully replayed in front of a jury. There would be no second-long trial where every contested detail is argued again in public. That absence leaves a vacuum, and the vacuum fills with speculation. Speculation is not evidence, but it is powerful. It is what keeps cases alive in the culture. People return to the same questions and try to finish the narrative on their own. In crime stories, people want a clean ending. Glensheen never offers one. Chapter 7. Aftermath: A Museum, a Shadow, and Why the Story Will Not Die. By the late 1970s, the Congdon family had arranged for Glensheen to go to the University of Minnesota. In 1979, Glensheen opened as a historic house museum. Its collection remained largely intact, which gave visitors the uncanny feeling that the household had simply paused. This changed the relationship between the public and the case. When a crime occurs in an ordinary home, the home can be sold, remodeled, or demolished. The setting can disappear. Glensheen did not disappear. It became more accessible. Visitors can walk through rooms built for elegance and sense the strange double nature of the place. It is a museum of Gilded Age life, and it is also a site marked by violence. Even when guides focus on architecture and history, visitors carry knowledge of the murders like a second soundtrack. If you visit Glensheen today, you can feel why the case endures. You can stand on the terrace and look out over Lake Superior. The view is wide and quiet. It is easy to imagine the Congdons believing they had built something that could resist time. Then you walk inside and feel the air change. Old houses hold temperature differently. They hold smell and sound differently. The wood absorbs footsteps. The rooms create a hush. A guide might speak about architecture, about the way the house was designed, about early 20th century domestic life. You learn how wealth was displayed and how it was supported by unseen work. And yet, even if no one mentions the murders, your mind returns to them. The staircase is no longer only a staircase. The upstairs corridor is no longer only a hallway. The bedroom is no longer only a room. Each space becomes a place where imagination collides with recorded fact. This is why the case feels like more than a single crime. It feels like an American myth written in brick and wood. The rise of wealth, the attempt to preserve legacy, the fracture caused by inheritance, the inability of the legal system to provide an ending that feels emotionally complete. Meanwhile, the people connected to the case continued into later life. Marjorie faced later legal trouble, including convictions related to arson and fraud, events that kept her name in public reporting long after the murder trial. Roger Caldwell, after his release, lived under the weight of notoriety. In 1988, he died by suicide. These later facts did not rewrite the murders, but they deepened the sense that Glensheen was not an isolated night. It was a long fracture that continued to send cracks outward. Epilogue: the lake, the house, and the cost of a legacy. Lake Superior does not care about human drama. It has watched industries rise and fall, families arrive and leave, headlines flare and fade. It holds its own history, older than any mansion. Glensheen still stands on its shore, beautiful and heavy with memory. At a distance, it looks like the promise Chester Congdon wanted to make real. A home that would outlast a single lifetime. A monument to an era when iron money could build a private palace. But the murders remind us of something more uncomfortable. A mansion can protect you from weather. It can protect you from certain hardships. It can even protect you from strangers. It cannot protect you from the people who know the doors. If you listen closely to why this case holds attention, it is not only because of the violence. It is because it sits at the intersection of history and psychology. History gives the setting meaning. A mansion built from iron money is not neutral. It represents an era, an economy, and a social structure. When something horrific happens inside such a place, it feels like history itself has been interrupted. Psychology gives the motive meaning. Inheritance is not only financial, it is emotional. It is identity. It is recognition. It is the promise that the sacrifices and frustrations of a life will be rewarded. When that promise feels blocked, the sense of injustice can become intense. Most people live with blocked promises without harming anyone, but the rare case where someone chooses violence shows how thin the line can become when need, entitlement, and opportunity align. Glensheen reminds us that legacy is fragile. You can build a house to last a century, but you cannot build a system that guarantees peace inside it. And sometimes the most dangerous force in a family is not hatred. It is need combined with entitlement. It is the belief that you deserve what someone else controls, and that the world has cheated you by placing it out of reach. That belief can turn relationships into calculations. It can turn inheritance into pressure. And in the worst case, it can turn a legacy into a motive. In the end, Glensheen forces a difficult reflection. The mansion was built to make a statement about permanence. Brick, stone, and craftsmanship were meant to outlast a single life. The family name was meant to outlast a single generation. And in one sense, that worked. The house still stands. People still speak the name. The estate is preserved. But in another sense, the dream collapsed. The house became famous not only for architecture, but for murder. The family legacy became inseparable from conflict. The promise of stability became a cautionary tale. History often works like this. The monuments remain, but the meaning changes. If you step outside and look at Lake Superior, you can imagine how small a human lifetime is compared to water and weather. And yet, inside those lifetimes, choices matter. A decision made in a moment of desperation can reshape how a place is remembered for decades. That is why this case still feels alive. It is not only a question of who, it is also a question of how easily a legacy can become a trap. Before we leave, it can help to hold the timeline in your mind as a single line. Glensheen was built between 1905 and 1908, during an era when the Mesabi iron economy created fortunes that could be turned into monuments. Chester Congdon died in 1916. Clara Congdon maintained the estate until her death in 1950. Elizabeth Congdon remained at Glensheen and became its anchor, later adopting Marjorie in 1932 and Jennifer in 1935. In her later years, Elizabeth suffered a disabling stroke and required round-the-clock care at home. As trust structures tightened control of money, Marjorie and her husband Roger Caldwell faced escalating financial pressure. Then came the night of June 26 and the morning of the 27th of June 1977, when nurse Velma Piatila was killed on the staircase and Elizabeth was killed in her bedroom. Roger Caldwell was arrested on the 6th of July 1977. He was convicted in July 1978 and sentenced to life, while Marjorie was tried and acquitted in July 1979. In 1982, the Minnesota Supreme Court overturned Roger's conviction and ordered a new trial. In 1983, Roger's guilty plea to second-degree murder ended the legal fight without delivering a clean emotional ending. In 1979, Glensheen opened as a historic house museum, preserving the earlier era even as the crime remained part of the place. That is why the story persists. The building holds both histories at once, and that is the quiet reason this case keeps people listening. It is not only a shocking night, it is a long story about how institutions shape families, trusts shaping money, money shaping relationships, and a famous house shaping the way the public remembers. The same staircase that once impressed guests became evidence. The same bedroom that once signaled comfort became a crime scene. When history is preserved in wood and brick, the story does not fade the way it does on paper. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel for more long-form history and true crime narratives where places and past events collide. And if you have a theory about what really happened at Glensheen, or why this case still feels unresolved, leave a comment below. I read them all, and your perspective might shape the next episode.